The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital had never seen such chaos. Outside, reporters pressed against the glass doors while camera crews set up their equipment on the sidewalk. Inside, the most expensive medical team money could buy worked frantically around a single patient lying unconscious on the gurney. Marcus Whitmore, the 73-year-old tech billionaire, had collapsed during his company's board meeting just 2 hours earlier. His personal assistant had called 911 immediately, but by the time the ambulance arrived at his downtown office, Marcus showed no signs of life. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart during the 20-minute ride to the hospital, but his condition remained critical. Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief cardiologist, led the team of 17 specialists that Marcus's family had flown in from around the world. Each doctor represented the pinnacle of their field. There was Dr. Chen, the neurologist who had saved 3 presidents. Dr. Rodriguez, the cardiac surgeon who had performed the first successful heart transplant in South America. Dr. Patel, the pulmonologist who had written textbooks that medical students studied worldwide. The medical team moved like a well-orchestrated symphony, each specialist calling out readings and recommendations. Blood pressure monitors beeped constantly. 4 drips fed medications into Marcus's veins. Machines breathed for him while others monitored every function of his failing body. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the tension that filled the air. Marcus's wife, Elizabeth, paced the hallway outside the emergency room. She had been married to him for 47 years and had never seen him look so fragile. Their 3 children stood nearby, each taking turns on phone calls with lawyers, business partners, and other family members. The Whitmore empire employed over 200,000 people across 6 continents, and news of Marcus's condition was already affecting stock prices. Dr. Harrison emerged from the emergency room every 30 minutes to update the family. His reports followed the same pattern each time. They had tried this medication, attempted that procedure, consulted with specialists via video conference. Nothing was working. Marcus's heart kept stopping, and each time they managed to restart it, his brain activity decreased further. The first doctor to give up was Dr. Williams, the infectious disease specialist. After running every test imaginable, he concluded that no virus or bacteria was causing Marcus's condition. He packed his equipment and left quietly through the back entrance, avoiding the reporters who had learned his name. Dr. Thompson, the toxicologist, was next. She had analyzed Marcus's blood for every known poison and found nothing suspicious. His collapse seemed to have no external cause, which made it even more mysterious and dangerous. She whispered her conclusions to Dr. Harrison before slipping away. One by one, the specialists reached the same devastating conclusion. Modern medicine had no answer for whatever was killing Marcus Whitmore. Dr. Martinez, the gastroenterologist, shook his head after reviewing the test results for the 3rd time. Dr. Kim, the endocrinologist, closed her laptop and admitted defeat. Dr. Okafor, the hematologist, had never encountered blood work quite like Marcus's. By midnight, only 7 of the original 17 doctors remained. The others had either given up or been dismissed by Dr. Harrison, who grew more frustrated with each failed attempt to save his patient. The remaining team looked exhausted. They had tried experimental drugs, cutting-edge procedures, and techniques that existed only in research papers. Marcus's family watched through the glass partition as the number of people working on their patriarch steadily decreased. Elizabeth had stopped crying hours ago and now stood perfectly still, as if moving might somehow make things worse. Their eldest son, David, had already begun making calls about funeral arrangements, though he tried to hide these conversations from his mother. The hospital's regular staff continued their shifts around the chaos. Nurses hurried past the emergency room, some stealing glances at the famous patient inside. Orderlies delivered supplies that the specialists demanded. Janitors worked quietly in the background, maintaining the sterile environment that everyone hoped would save Marcus's life. Dr. Harrison finally admitted what everyone had begun to suspect. After consulting with colleagues at Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, and medical centers in London and Tokyo, he had run out of options. Marcus's condition defied medical explanation. His organs were failing in a pattern that no textbook had ever described. The billionaire's breathing became more labored despite the ventilator. His heart rate, which had been erratic all evening, began to slow. The monitors that had beeped constantly for hours started displaying numbers that made the remaining doctors exchange worried glances. Elizabeth Whitmore was called into the emergency room at 2:30 in the morning. Dr. Harrison explained gently that they had done everything possible. The world's best doctors had exhausted every option. Marcus had maybe an hour left, and the family should prepare to say goodbye. The news spread quickly through the hospital corridors. The billionaire who had revolutionized 3 industries was dying, and medical science had failed him completely. The reporters outside sensed the change in mood and began preparing their cameras for the announcement they all expected. As Elizabeth held her husband's hand, she noticed something strange. Despite all the machines and medications, despite the 17 doctors and their advanced training, Marcus looked peaceful. The stress lines that had marked his face for decades seemed to have disappeared. His breathing, though assisted by machines, had found a steady rhythm. That's when she first noticed the nurse who had been quietly working in the corner of the room throughout the entire ordeal. While doctors came and went, this woman had remained constant, checking Marcus's 4 lines, adjusting his pillows, and monitoring his comfort with a calmness that seemed impossible given the chaos surrounding them. The nurse appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen everything the medical world could offer, both its triumphs and its failures. Her name tag read Sarah, but Elizabeth had not seen her speak to any of the doctors or receive any instructions from Dr. Harrison's team. Sarah seemed to exist in her own bubble within the emergency room, following protocols that none of the specialists had mentioned. She checked Marcus's pulse the old-fashioned way, with her fingers on his wrist, rather than relying solely on the electronic monitors. She adjusted the lighting around his bed to reduce glare. She even hummed softly while working, a melody that somehow made the room feel less sterile and frightening. The remaining doctors prepared to disconnect the machines that were keeping Marcus alive. Dr. Harrison spoke with Elizabeth about organ donation and the procedures that would follow Marcus's death. The legal team that had been waiting in the hospital cafeteria was summoned to handle the immediate business consequences of losing the company's founder and CEO. But Sarah continued her quiet work, seemingly unaware that everyone else had given up hope. She checked the temperature of Marcus's hands and feet, adjusted the position of his head, and made notes on a clipboard that appeared to have nothing to do with the official medical charts that the doctors had been maintaining. As the family gathered around Marcus's bed for their final goodbye, Sarah finally spoke for the first time all evening. Her voice was soft but carried clearly through the room. She asked Dr. Harrison a simple question that would change everything. Has anyone checked his magnesium levels in the last 4 hours? Dr. Harrison paused with his hand halfway to the ventilator controls. Sarah's question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the medical team had attempted over the past 6 hours. Magnesium levels seemed absurdly simple compared to the complex procedures and experimental treatments they had tried. His electrolytes were checked when he arrived, Dr. Harrison replied, his voice showing the strain of the long night. Everything appeared normal. But, even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. The admission records from 6 hours ago felt like ancient history given everything that had happened since. Sarah nodded calmly and moved to Marcus's bedside. She lifted his eyelid gently and examined his pupil with a small flashlight from her pocket. Then, she pressed her fingers against the pulse point on his neck, counting silently while watching the second hand on the wall clock. Her movements seemed to follow a different rhythm than the frantic energy that had dominated the room all night. I've been watching his muscle responses, Sarah explained quietly. The way his hands are positioned, the slight tremor in his legs when the medication wears off. These could indicate severe magnesium depletion. She made another note on her clipboard before looking directly at Dr. Harrison. Sometimes the obvious answer is hiding behind all the complex possibilities. Elizabeth Whitmore found herself holding her breath. After hours of watching brilliant doctors fail to save her husband, this quiet nurse was suggesting something that sounded almost too simple to be true. But there was something in Sarah's voice, a confidence built on years of experience, that made everyone in the room pay attention. Dr. Harrison checked the computer terminal that displayed Marcus's latest blood work. The magnesium reading showed 1.8 milligrams per deciliter, which fell within the normal range according to standard laboratory values. But Sarah was already looking over his shoulder, pointing to something else on the screen. "Look at the timestamp," she said. "This was drawn at 7:15 when he first arrived. It's now almost 3 in the morning. His body has been fighting for 8 hours, using up minerals faster than we've been replacing them." She paused to check Marcus's pulse again. "And look at all the medications he's received. Half of them deplete magnesium as a side effect." The logic was undeniable, but Dr. Harrison felt frustrated that such a basic oversight might have cost them precious time. "Even if you're right, we're talking about a minor electrolyte imbalance. This man is dying from multiple organ failure. Magnesium isn't going to cure what's wrong with him." Sarah didn't argue. Instead, she pulled up Marcus's chart on the computer and began scrolling through the timeline of his treatment. "Dr. Harrison, what was the first medication you gave him when his heart stopped in the ambulance?" "Epinephrine, of course. Standard protocol." "And when his heart stopped again an hour ago?" "More epinephrine, along with atropine and calcium chloride." Sarah nodded and pointed to the screen. "All 3 of those medications become less effective when magnesium levels drop too low. It's like trying to start a car with a dead battery. You can turn the key all you want, but nothing happens until you fix the real problem." Dr. Chen, the neurologist, had been listening quietly from across the room. He approached the computer terminal and began reviewing the neurological tests he had performed earlier. "The brain activity patterns I observed could be consistent with severe electrolyte imbalance," he admitted reluctantly. "I interpreted them as signs of hypoxia, but magnesium deficiency can cause similar readings." Elizabeth watched this conversation with growing hope and confusion. She had spent her entire adult life married to a man who solved complex problems for a living. Marcus had built his fortune by finding simple solutions that everyone else had overlooked. The idea that his life might depend on something as basic as a mineral supplement seemed both fitting and terrifying. Sarah was already preparing a syringe with magnesium sulfate. "Dr. Harrison, I need your order for 2 grams 4 push, followed by a continuous drip. We should also check his phosphorus and potassium levels immediately." The lead cardiologist hesitated. Everything in his training told him that Marcus Whitmore was beyond saving. 17 specialists had exhausted every option. The man's family was already saying goodbye. Starting a new treatment now seemed like torture for everyone involved. But something in Sarah's manner made him reconsider. She wasn't desperate or emotional like everyone else in the room. She moved with the steady confidence of someone who had seen this exact situation before and knew exactly what to do about it. Her calmness was more convincing than any passionate argument could have been. 2 grams of magnesium sulfate, Dr. Harrison ordered finally. "But I want continuous monitoring. If his condition worsens, we stop immediately." Sarah drew up the medication with steady hands while the remaining doctors gathered around the monitors. The room felt different now, filled with cautious hope rather than resigned defeat. Even the machines seemed to beep with less urgency, as if sensing the shift in mood. The magnesium went into Marcus's 4 lines slowly. Sarah explained that rapid infusion could cause more problems, so they had to be patient. She adjusted his position slightly, ensuring that his airway remained clear and that blood flow to his extremities wasn't restricted. For the first 10 minutes, nothing changed. Marcus remained unconscious, dependent on machines for every vital function. The monitors displayed the same discouraging numbers they had shown all night. Dr. Harrison began to think that Sarah's suggestion, while medically sound, had come too late to make any difference. Then, Marcus's heart rate began to stabilize. The irregular rhythm that had plagued him all evening started to smooth out. His blood pressure, which had required constant medication to maintain, began to rise on its own. The changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable unless someone was watching carefully. Sarah was watching very carefully. She noted each small improvement on her clipboard while making tiny adjustments to Marcus's care. She elevated his legs slightly to improve circulation. She adjusted the oxygen flow to match his improving blood levels. She even dimmed the harsh overhead lights that had been glaring down on him all night. Dr. Rodriguez, the cardiac surgeon, was the first to voice what everyone was beginning to think. His heart rhythm is definitely improving. Look at the EKG pattern from 20 minutes ago compared to now. The difference was unmistakable, even to Elizabeth, who had no medical training. But the real test came when Dr. Harrison decided to reduce Marcus's dependence on the ventilator. If the magnesium was truly helping, Marcus should begin breathing more effectively on his own. Sarah suggested they make the change gradually, allowing his body to adjust slowly rather than forcing a sudden transition. As the ventilator support decreased, Marcus's own breathing efforts increased. His chest rose and fell with more strength than it had shown in hours. The oxygen levels in his blood remained stable, then began to improve. For the first time all night, the direction of his vital signs was pointing toward recovery rather than decline. Elizabeth found herself crying again, but these were different tears. She squeezed Marcus's hand and thought she felt the faintest pressure in return. "Did you see that?" she asked Sarah, who smiled and nodded. "He's fighting," Sarah replied simply. His body just needed the right tools to do its job. Dr. Harrison stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the monitors in amazement. In 30 years of practicing medicine, he had never seen such a dramatic turnaround from such a simple intervention. All the advanced technology and experimental procedures had failed, but a basic understanding of human physiology had succeeded. The other doctors began to filter back into the room as news of Marcus's improvement spread through the hospital. Some looked embarrassed that they had missed such a fundamental issue. Others seemed genuinely curious about how Sarah had recognized the problem when so many specialists had not. But Sarah continued working quietly, focused entirely on her patient rather than the growing attention around her. She checked Marcus's reflexes, tested his response to light, and monitored his temperature. Each assessment showed continued improvement, small steps back toward consciousness and health. As dawn approached, Marcus Whitmore opened his eyes for the first time in 10 hours. He looked confused and weak, but he was undeniably alive and aware. His first word was a whispered "Elizabeth," followed by a question about what had happened to him. The story of his recovery would make headlines around the world, but Sarah had already moved on to her next patient. She left detailed notes for the day shift and quietly slipped out of the emergency room before anyone could interview her about the miracle she had performed. Marcus Whitmore spent the next 3 days in the intensive care unit, recovering from what doctors now understood had been severe electrolyte depletion complicated by medication interactions. The story of his near-death experience and miraculous recovery dominated business news cycles around the world. Stock prices for his companies rebounded as investors realized their worst fears had not materialized. But Marcus himself was focused on something entirely different. He kept asking about the nurse who had saved his life, describing her to every hospital employee who entered his room. The problem was that none of the ICU staff knew who he was talking about. Sarah had worked the emergency room shift that night, not the intensive care unit, and she seemed to have vanished as quietly as she had appeared. Elizabeth tried to help her husband's search by contacting Dr. Harrison, who promised to look into the matter. But when the hospital administrator checked the staff records, they found something puzzling. There was indeed a nurse named Sarah Collins who had been scheduled for the emergency room that night, but she had called in sick with food poisoning. The woman who had saved Marcus's life was not in any of their employment records. "That's impossible," Dr. Harrison insisted when the administrator shared this information. "I saw her myself. She gave me medical orders. She accessed our computer systems. She couldn't have done any of that without proper authorization." But, despite his certainty, the security cameras from that night showed no trace of the mysterious nurse. Marcus's recovery continued steadily. His strength returned, his mental clarity improved, and all his vital signs stabilized within normal ranges. Medical journals would later publish case studies about his condition, focusing on the importance of monitoring electrolyte levels during extended medical emergencies. But the patient himself remained obsessed with finding the woman who had recognized what 17 specialists had missed. The media attention surrounding Marcus's recovery created its own problems. Reporters camped outside the hospital, hoping for interviews with the medical team that had saved the famous billionaire. Dr. Harrison found himself giving press conferences about the case, carefully avoiding any mention of the mysterious nurse whose identity remained unknown. Inside the hospital, rumors began to spread among the nursing staff. Some claimed they remembered seeing Sarah that night, but their descriptions varied wildly. One nurse remembered her as tall with blonde hair, while another insisted she had been short with dark curls. A third nurse was certain that Sarah had been wearing scrubs from a different hospital entirely. Marcus's son David hired a private investigator to locate Sarah Collins, the nurse who had supposedly called in sick that night. The investigation revealed that Sarah was indeed a real person with an impressive nursing background, but she had been home with food poisoning exactly as the hospital records indicated. Her roommate, her doctor, and even her pizza delivery receipt confirmed her alibi. "I don't understand what's happening," David told his father during one of his daily hospital visits. "We have witnesses who saw this nurse save your life, but we can't prove she was ever really there." He showed Marcus the investigator's report, which raised more questions than it answered. Elizabeth had her own theory about the mysterious Sarah. As a woman of deep faith, she believed that Marcus had been saved by divine intervention, with the nurse serving as an earthly angel sent to deliver the knowledge that saved his life. She didn't need to understand how it had happened, only that it had happened when they needed it most. Marcus, however, was a man of science and business. He had built his fortune on logic, evidence, and verifiable facts. The idea that his life had been saved by someone who might not have existed challenged everything he believed about how the world worked. He spent hours reviewing security footage from that night, but the quality was too poor to make out individual faces clearly. Dr. Harrison faced his own crisis of understanding. He had spoken directly with the nurse, had taken her medical advice, and had watched her perform competent patient care throughout the night. But now his colleagues questioned whether the stress of the situation had caused him to imagine conversations that never happened. The hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Williams, called a meeting to discuss the case. He was concerned about the publicity surrounding Marcus's recovery and wanted to ensure that all staff members gave consistent accounts to the media. The meeting included everyone who had been working that night, but none of them could agree on what they had actually witnessed. "Medical emergencies create stress," Dr. Williams explained to the assembled staff. "Sometimes our memories play tricks on us. We remember what we needed to see rather than what actually happened." But even as he spoke, he could see doubt in the faces around the conference table. Marcus's physical recovery was complete by the end of the week, but his emotional journey was just beginning. He had always prided himself on being a rational man who understood the world through evidence and logic. The mystery of his salvation challenged those beliefs in ways that made him uncomfortable but also strangely grateful. On his last day in the hospital, Marcus asked to visit the emergency room where his life had been saved. He wanted to see the space again, hoping it might trigger some memory or provide some clue about the woman who had helped him. Dr. Harrison agreed to escort him personally. The emergency room looked completely different during the day shift. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows, and the atmosphere was calm and professional rather than chaotic and desperate. Marcus stood in the spot where his gurney had been positioned and tried to reconstruct the events of that night. "She was standing right over there," he told Dr. Harrison, pointing to a corner near the medical supply cabinet. "She had graying hair and a ponytail, and she moved like someone with decades of experience. I remember thinking she seemed calmer than everyone else in the room." Dr. Harrison nodded. He had the same memory, but he was beginning to question its reliability. "Memory is a strange thing, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes we remember what we needed to happen rather than what actually happened." But Marcus wasn't ready to accept such explanations. Before leaving the hospital, he established the Sarah Collins Foundation, dedicated to improving emergency medical training with a focus on basic patient care skills. He donated $10 million to the hospital with the stipulation that they create a program emphasizing the kind of observational skills that had saved his life. The foundation's first initiative was to review medical education curricula at nursing schools around the country. Marcus discovered that modern medical training focused heavily on technology and procedures while spending less time on traditional bedside manner and patient observation skills. "We're training people to read machines instead of reading patients," Marcus told Elizabeth during one of their conversations about the foundation's work. Maybe that's why it took someone like Sarah to see what all those specialists missed. The mystery of Sarah's identity remained unsolved, but her impact on Marcus's life continued to grow. He began spending more time on philanthropic activities and less time on business expansion. He established new policies at his companies that prioritized employee health and wellness, inspired by his own brush with mortality. Elizabeth watched her husband's transformation with amazement and gratitude. The man who had almost died in that emergency room was returning to her as someone more thoughtful and present than he had been in decades. Whether Sarah had been real or imaginary, her influence on their family was undeniably positive. The medical community continued to study Marcus's case, but they focused on the clinical aspects rather than the mystery of his treatment. Research papers were published about electrolyte monitoring in emergency situations. Medical conferences featured presentations about the importance of basic nursing skills in complex cases. But, among the nursing staff at hospitals around the country, Sarah's story took on a life of its own. Nurses shared the account of the mysterious colleague who had appeared when needed most and vanished once her work was done. Some saw it as inspiration to trust their instincts even when surrounded by more credentialed professionals. Marcus never stopped looking for answers about that night. He hired additional investigators, reviewed more security footage, and interviewed every hospital employee who had been working during his emergency. The search became both a passion and an obsession, driven by his need to thank the person who had given him a second chance at life. As months passed, Marcus began to accept that he might never solve the mystery of Sarah's identity. But he realized that the search itself had changed him in ways that were perhaps more important than finding the answers he sought. The experience had taught him humility and shown him the value of knowledge that couldn't be measured in degrees or certifications. The Sarah Collins Foundation continued to grow, funding nursing education programs and emergency medical research around the world. Marcus often spoke at medical conferences about his experience, always ending his presentations with the same message: sometimes the most important medical interventions come from the most basic understanding of human needs. His story became legendary in medical circles, but Marcus preferred to focus on the practical lessons it offered. He established mentorship programs that paired experienced nurses with young doctors, recognizing that wisdom could flow in both directions regardless of formal hierarchy. 2 years after his miraculous recovery, Marcus Whitmore received a phone call that would finally solve the mystery that had consumed him since that night in the emergency room. The call came from Dr. Patricia Martinez, the chief nursing officer at a small rural hospital in Montana, nearly 2,000 miles from where Marcus had almost died. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe I may have information about the nurse you've been searching for," Dr. Martinez said during their conversation. "I've been following your story through the Sarah Collins Foundation, and I think you need to hear about someone who worked for us until recently." Dr. Martinez explained that her hospital had employed a traveling nurse named Sarah Thompson for 6 months the previous year. Sarah had been an exceptional nurse with over 30 years of experience, known for her calm demeanor during emergencies and her ability to spot problems that others missed. But there had been something unusual about her employment with them. "She never stayed anywhere very long," Dr. Martinez continued. 6 months was actually longer than usual for her. She would appear when hospitals were facing staffing shortages, work brilliantly for a while, then move on to wherever she was needed next. "We tried to convince her to stay permanently, but she said she preferred to go where she could make the most difference." Marcus felt his heart racing as he listened to the description. Did she ever mention working in emergency rooms? Or any experience with electrolyte imbalances? Dr. Martinez laughed softly. That was actually her specialty. She had an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mineral deficiencies just by observing patients. She saved at least 3 lives during her time with us using exactly the approach you've described in your interviews. The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez mentioned that Sarah had left behind a forwarding address for her final paycheck. It was a post office box in a small town in Oregon, where she was apparently helping to set up a new critical care unit at another rural hospital. Marcus immediately arranged to fly there, bringing Elizabeth and their son David with him. The town of Millbrook, Oregon, had a population of fewer than 5,000 people, but its hospital served a much larger rural area. The facility was small but modern, recently upgraded with funds from a federal grant program designed to improve healthcare access in underserved communities. Marcus found Sarah Thompson in the hospital's education center, teaching a class of young nurses about emergency patient assessment. She looked exactly as he remembered her from that chaotic night 2 years earlier, graying hair in a ponytail, calm eyes that seemed to take in everything, and movements that spoke of decades of experience. When the class ended, Marcus approached her nervously. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Thompson?" She turned and smiled, showing no surprise at seeing him. "Hello, Mr. Whitmore. I wondered when you might track me down. How are you feeling these days?" The simple question broke down all the barriers that Marcus had built up during his 2-year search. He found himself crying as he tried to express his gratitude to the woman who had saved his life. Elizabeth hugged Sarah impulsively, thanking her for giving them back their husband and father. Sarah's explanation of that night was both simple and complex. She had indeed been working at St. Mary's Hospital, but not as a regular employee. She was a traveling nurse who filled emergency staffing gaps, and she had been called in that night when the hospital realized they needed additional experienced personnel for Marcus's case. The paperwork got confused in all the chaos, Sarah explained as they sat in the hospital cafeteria. "I was supposed to be processed as a temporary contractor, but somehow my credentials got mixed up with another nurse who had called in sick. By the time anyone realized the mistake, I was already working on your case." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "But why didn't you stay to get credit for saving my life? The media attention could have launched your career in ways you can't imagine." Sarah's answer revealed the heart of who she was as both a nurse and a person. "I didn't save your life for credit or recognition, Mr. Whitmore. I did it because it was my job and because you needed help. Once you were stable, my work was done. I had other patients in other places who needed me just as much." She went on to explain that she had been a traveling nurse for over 15 years, ever since her husband died of cancer. She had realized that her skills could make the biggest difference in places that were understaffed or facing unusual challenges. She deliberately sought out assignments where her experience could save lives that might otherwise be lost. "I've worked in disaster zones after hurricanes," Sarah told them. "I've helped set up medical clinics in refugee camps. I've filled in at hospitals during flu epidemics when their regular staff was overwhelmed. That night with you was just another emergency where I happened to be in the right place at the right time." David asked the question that had puzzled the investigators for 2 years. "But why was there no record of you working that night? How did you access the computer systems without proper authorization?" Sarah smiled at the question. "Dr. Harrison gave me his login credentials when he was overwhelmed with everything else that was happening. It's not unusual during medical emergencies. People bend the rules when lives are at stake." She paused thoughtfully. "As for the employment records, I suspect the hospital administration was embarrassed that they couldn't explain my presence, so they may have chosen to overlook the documentation issues." The truth was both more mundane and more remarkable than Marcus had imagined. There had been no miracle, no divine intervention, no mysterious appearance of an angel in nursing scrubs. Instead, there had been a dedicated professional who had recognized a problem that others had missed and acted on her knowledge without concern for recognition or reward. But Marcus realized that this explanation made Sarah's actions even more meaningful, not less. She had saved his life not because she was supernatural, but because she was an extraordinary human being who had dedicated her career to helping others. The Sarah Collins Foundation immediately offered Sarah a position as its Director of Nursing Education, with a salary that would have made her one of the highest-paid nurses in the country. But she declined politely, explaining that she was needed in Millbrook for at least another 6 months to complete the critical care training program. Instead, Sarah agreed to work with the foundation as a consultant, helping to develop curricula that emphasized observational skills and critical thinking in emergency situations. She would travel to medical schools and hospitals around the country, sharing the knowledge that had saved Marcus's life with a new generation of healthcare providers. Marcus kept in touch with Sarah regularly after their meeting, but he never asked her to change her chosen path of traveling nursing. He had learned to respect her dedication to going wherever she was needed most, even though it meant she would probably never stay in one place long enough to receive the recognition she deserved. The Foundation's work expanded under Sarah's influence, focusing on programs that supported traveling nurses and improved emergency medical care in underserved areas. Marcus funded mobile training units that brought advanced nursing education to rural hospitals that couldn't otherwise access such programs. Years later, Marcus would often tell people that meeting Sarah had taught him more about success than all his business achievements combined. She had shown him that the most important work was often done quietly, without fanfare or recognition, by people who were motivated purely by their desire to help others. Elizabeth noticed that her husband's priorities had permanently shifted after finding Sarah. He spent less time focused on growing his wealth and more time thinking about how to use his resources to support people like Sarah who were making a difference in the world. The mystery that had consumed Marcus for 2 years was finally solved, but it had transformed him in ways that went far beyond simple answers. He had learned that sometimes the most profound miracles come not from supernatural intervention, but from ordinary people doing extraordinary work with skill, compassion, and humility. Sarah Thompson continued her traveling nursing career, appearing where she was needed and moving on once her work was done. She rarely stayed anywhere long enough to become famous, but she left behind a trail of lives saved and young nurses inspired by her example. Marcus Whitmore lived for many more years, his health carefully monitored and his mineral levels regularly checked. But, more importantly, he lived those years with a deeper appreciation for the people who dedicate their lives to caring for others, especially those who do their work quietly and without expectation of reward. The Sarah Collins Foundation became one of the most respected medical education organizations in the world, but Sarah herself remained a traveling nurse, following her calling to go wherever her skills could make the biggest difference. In the end, Marcus realized that this was exactly as it should be.